Good morning, everyone. It's Tony here from Loxter Reads. It's World Poetry Day today, so I thought I'd do a very quick run through some poetry recommendations based on one in my hand here, based on just a sort of quick run through my library and some things that I've read over the last few years that I have found most interesting. I'm going to start off with a choice of Anglo-Saxon verse edited by Richard Hamer. This is a collection of, well, as it says, Anglo-Saxon verse. It's mainly the shorter poems. There's an extract from Beowulf in. I recommend Beowulf. There's many translations of Beowulf. I'm planning to read a couple of them next month in what I'm calling Anglo-Saxon April. The one I've read so far that I like the most is Seamus Heaney's version. This is a simultaneous. Is a George, so it's got the Anglo-Saxon on this side and the translation on this side. There's some beautiful poetry in here, and as an introduction to the Anglo-Saxon world from a poetic point of view, I think this is great. From a similar time period and a similar culture. This is the Gododin Lament for the Fallen, translated by Gillian Clarke. Again, this one has the original Old Welsh on this side and the translation here. This is basically as I said, a lament for the fallen. It's a book about the men who went and to fight a battle against the Anglo-Saxons and who died fighting it. It's surprisingly moving and beautiful, and there's it's a sort of poetry that isn't written anymore. Poems about war are still written, but poems like this about war aren't. Although I think that the book I'm going to talk about next is partly an attempt to do that. But yeah, recommend this. So the next one that I wanted to talk about is David Jones's In Parenthesis. I made a video about this being my favourite book from World War One. It's a long poem in 7 sections that tells the story of men from their leaving, specifically John Bull, from their leaving England to the end at Mehmet's Wood. It's a very thick poem. It's full of literary references and allusions. I still think it's very beautiful. The final section in particular is very moving, but the whole thing is great. David Jones is an interesting man as well, which I think helps. But yeah, in parenthesis, I know when I recommend this to people that not everybody's going to like it and not everybody's going to get through it. But for me, this is one of the great poetry books. Then let's go in a sort of weird date order. Shakespeare's Sonnets with Coffee Blob. This is the copy that I carry around with me. I love this. I've read it several times. I reread it a lot. I read it in the Dirty Duck pub in Stratford upon Avon when I was going to see a Shakespeare play at the RSC. Pretentious chap that I am. I love reading this because I get something out of it all the time. It's also fun for the debates that it's created about things like Shakespeare's sexuality, and who the dark woman is in this, and who the man is in this that these poems are about. I sometimes think that critics forget that poets can just decide to write about things that aren't like it. Shakespeare could be gay, could be straight, could be both. It's possible that somebody can use their imagination to write poems aimed at a man without being gay, and to write poems written about women without being straight. People have written gay people have written love stories about straight people forever, because they've had to. Sometimes they are queer coded, but a lot of the time they aren't. But and in a way, does I suppose it does matter in terms of representation, but in terms of the work, does it really matter? The It's like the whole Shakespeare. I'm going off on a tangent. It's like the whole Shakespeare authorship issue, which I think is motivated more by snobbery than anything else. In the end, it's the work that matters and the work that stands. So anyway, Shakespeare sonnets. Read them if you haven't read them. They aren't always easy to understand. I mean, one of the things about poetry is often that it isn't easy to crack on the first read, and it really does need a slow, committed read. I have tried in recent. I am a very fast reader normally, and sometimes to my detriment. So I try to slow my reading down with poetry. Um, these things are recommend. Look, it's a slim volume. It's only 140, 151 to 52, 154 poems. So you could take your time. You could read a couple a day to get through it. You don't have to rush through it. But yes, recommended. On a similar coffee stained cover ilk, problem with white covers and reading while drinking coffee or putting books down while drinking coffee. This is Rainer Maria Rilke's. It's two collections in one. It's Duano Elegies and some of the sonnets to Orpheus. Rilke these days, I suppose, is probably best known for Letters to a Young Poet. I don't know how many people actually read his poems, but these are beautiful. It also contains a fragment of a line that is among my just a way to start. The second elegy just starts with, "Every angel is terrifying, and yet, alas, I invoke you, almost deadly birds of the soul, knowing about you." Which I think is brilliant. Again, this is a translation that's got the original German on this side, the English translation on that side. They're beautifully written. Again, you have to really think about what's in them, what they're trying to say, and there's a whole discussion to be had about poetry in translation and how difficult it is to convey what the original is trying to say, because there's issues of language and issues of meter and technicalities, for want of a better word, and how the translator decides to tackle those to present a English version is quite interesting. Next up, who should we go for next? Oh, I'll go for a recent one. Caroline Bird is one of my favourite recent poets. This is Ambush at Steel Lake. I have to say, part of the reason I love this book is the cover is so good. But Caroline Bird is one of my favourite modern poets. I recommend this. Again, the thing with poetry collections is they're short and you can take your time over them, and you should take your time over them. Read them out loud. I always find that's a really good, or listen to an audio book while you read the text in front of you. I always find that's a very useful way of getting an understanding of what you're reading. Poems shouldn't be puzzles in their entirety, but sometimes they are, because poets have to, or often have to, distill language down to its most distilled. God, you can tell I'm not a poet. And therefore meaning is sometimes has to be dug out. Get some even worse. But yeah, recommend this. Then let's say, I've got Louise Gluck. I own 3 of Louise Gluck's collections. I think Averno is my favourite, but these are Louise Gluck is a modern-ish poet whose work I really admire. I only started reading her work back in the 2000s, and it was in the first point. It was in that first flush of when I started trying to read more poetry, and it was her that helped me get back into, or to get into even, poetry. I don't know how much poetry I read before I was in my 40s. A bit, but not a lot. And a lot of that was classic stuff. that I was either doing at school or when I was doing my Latin A level. I didn't really actually bring up any classical poets for whatever reason, but yeah, Louise Gluck, that's another one. Then there is Louis MacNeice. I've got here The Burning Perch, which is a collection, selected poems, and I've got somewhere the Autumn Journal, but I couldn't find that. The Autumn Journal is a long poem about written in 1938 about the run up to World War Two. It's a beautiful poem, and it's about love as well, and about lots of other things. I think that's the favourite thing of MacNeice's that I've read so far, but both of these are really good. So yeah, Louis MacNeice recommended. Then what should I do next? Oh, let me do. Oh, you can see that picture there is the poet I'm about to talk about. Anna Akhmatova, a Russian poet. I really liked her work. I stumbled across it. I can't remember why. I think I saw it quoted in a book about the Russian Revolution. She suffered at the hands of Stalin. Her family suffered at the hands of Stalin. But she's part of the. There's four very famous Russian poets of the same time period, whose names I'm going to struggle to remember: Setsvaya, Osip Mandelstam, her, and there's somebody else. But I recommend all of those poets. But I have a real fondness for Anna Akhmatova. Actually, it was Clive James when I first came across mention of her, when I read his book Cultural Amnesia. There's a whole section on her in that, and it made me want to read her poetry. Yeah, and to the point at which, as I said, I've got a portrait of her on my wall, which I got, I think, from the National Portrait Gallery. So I recommend Anna Akhmatova. This is a bit of a rushed thing, but I wanted to do something for World Poetry Day, and I just wanted to get across. I never used to read much poetry because I used to, as I said, I read fast. I read too fast for my own good sometimes, and poetry is the worst thing to read if you're a fast reader. I never used to take a breath to try, and if I didn't understand it, I would sweep through it. Sometimes now, I can read a poem 3 or 4 times and still think I'm not quite sure what this is trying to say, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I just think there's a tendency to try and rush through poems in a way that you shouldn't. But yeah, the next thing. This is a long poem. This is a long modernist poem. This is Hope Mearley's Paris, a poem. This was almost forgotten. I'd say it's a great, almost lost poem. Hope Mearley's is probably best known these days for her novel Blood in a Mist. It was written, I think, originally in 1919, in sort of Paris at the end. 1920 it was first published. It's a really brilliant poem. I recommend this to people all the time, and usually they like it. This is the Faber and Faber hardback. I don't know if this is the only. If this is still, I assume this is still in print. I don't know if there's a paperback version, but I bought this as soon as I heard it was coming out. I think I came across. I didn't know anything about Hope Mearley's until I listened to an episode of Backlisted, which is a very good book podcast, and they did an episode on Blood in a Mist and mentioned this, which is why I picked it up. Next, T.S. Eliot. If you're talking of poets that are hard to crack, sometimes unnecessarily so, there's T.S. Eliot. This is the collected poems. I've also there's also his more this other sort of his 4 quartets and those kind of things. I have got copies of those, but I think I've only got them on Kindle, so I can't wave them about. T.S. Eliot is another modernist poet. He is quite hard to understand sometimes, and again, I sometimes wonder if it's deliberate. Like there's a culture sometimes with writers of certain things that what they write must be hard to understand, because if it's too easy to understand, it's not quite high quality enough. I do sometimes think T.S. Eliot suffers from that. There's also the element of his anti-Semitism, but we'll elide over that for the moment. But yeah, T.S. Eliot, I do think it's worth reading his stuff. And the good thing about Eliot is you can come back to it over and over again and try and understand what he's doing. He's also a very good literary critic, so it's worth reading his literary criticism. But yeah, T.S. Eliot. And finally, as I said, this is almost arbitrary. This isn't my favourite poets of all time. This isn't my favourite poetry collections of all time. This was a let me have a look around my library, pick up the stuff that I think that I would recommend to people. And the last one is Anna Blandiana's 5 books, translated by Paul Scott Derrick and Viorica Peter. Anna Blandiana is a Romanian poet. These are collections of her poems. There's 2 collections of love poems in here: October, November, December, and Variations on a Given Theme. But there's also 3 other collections. These were written from 1985, well, actually from the 70s to 2018. They are super. I think she's a superb poet. This is translated, but there are no simultaneous. There's no. It's all English. There's no original Romanian on the other side. But if I would recommend one poet who you might not have heard of that I think you should really dig out, Anna Blandiana is one of them. So yeah, there are many other poets that I would mention. As I said, I didn't talk about any classic poets. I didn't talk about Sappho. I didn't talk about Catullus. I didn't talk about Horace. I didn't talk about Dante. I didn't talk about Donne. I didn't talk about the Romantic poets. I didn't talk about Yeats. I didn't talk about so many poets and so many modern poets. But on World Poetry Day, this was just a way of trying to encourage you to maybe pick up some poetry books. I recommend to people all the time they should read more poetry. Some people don't like poetry or struggle with poetry. I think it's partly because I think the way you are expected to read it is not necessarily the way to read it. I think trying to read it out loud, if you can, or get an audio book and listen to it alongside the text. If you can do that, is the best way. I think poets might not necessarily agree with this, but I think poetry is meant to be read out loud. Anglo-Saxon poetry was definitely meant to be read out loud, as was most classical poetry actually. But I think it slows you down as well. That's the other thing. Reading it out loud slows you down. I made a vow about 4 years ago to read more poetry, and there's a couple of years, particularly sort of during the pandemic and around the pandemic, where I read a lot of more poetry books, modern and old. I have collections of lots of poetry collections that I dip into and out of from great poets. I just wish people would read more poetry. I'm not telling you you're wrong if you don't read poetry. I'm not judging you for not reading poetry, but I think it's a benefit to your life. One of my sad wishes is that I don't have a well, you can learn poetry, but I wish I had a memory where I could just stick it in my head on a first or second read, because sometimes with all the poetry that I've read over the years, there is an appetite quote for pretty much any occasion, and I wish I could pull them out when I needed to. There's a lot of Shakespeare quotes that are apt for politics, but other poets: love, grief, justice, hate, pain, joy, summer, spring, autumn. There's a poem for daffodils, plants, flowers, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, probably. So yeah, this is a brief. I say brief. It's going to be about 20 minutes video to sort of flag up some poetry on World Poetry Day and to say to you, please read more poetry. It'll benefit you. And it's fun. Anyway, that's it. Have a good day. Thanks very much. Bye bye.